Hey, Expat Dad here, and today we're going to compare what's going on with Iran with another war that happened roughly 90 years ago. So imagine a situation in which the United States is involved in a war with a Jew hating and a Jew fighting nation that has an evil regime. So I think you already guessed correctly what war I'm talking about, and it's the World War II, in which we dealt with the evil regime of Nazi Germany. So what we're going to go into today is we're going to compare these two, and you're going to, at the end of this video, understand just how similar the situations are and the lessons that we can learn from these similarities. Now, of course, history repeats itself, but it doesn't mean that they're not exactly the same. But still, let's see what we can learn from it. So we're going to first talk about the players, the main players of the war, and then we're going to talk about what led to the conflict and the conflict itself, and then we're going to talk about the war itself. So first, let's look into the players of this particular conflict. Let's talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So he's the darling of the Democrat Party. They love him. He's very much revered today, but the irony is that at the time when he was president, he was criticized for being a fascist. Does this sound familiar with what's going on with Trump? And he would arguably, he was even more of a Hitler Nazi-like president because he was implementing government authority onto the United States at a time where there was less of it. So this is just to give you an idea of how similar what's happening now is what happened then. So let's talk about FDR. FDR at the time was described as someone who was being led by the nose by the British. So today, a criticism of what's going on is that the Israeli government is lobbying the United States government and is influencing the Trump administration to get into this conflict. Well, if we look at what happened prior to World War II, the same arguments were made with the British. The British, which was the British Empire at the time, was not really a nation or a kingdom that we really liked. I mean, they owed us money from World War I. They were the empire. We had some bad blood from our past, and here they were lobbying our government and forcing us in their own way to fight a war in a region that was not our concern. Does this sound familiar? FDR had critics like Charles Lindbergh that were saying that he was being led by the British to fight this war in Europe. Another player is Churchill. So Winston Churchill is revered, and we understand there's some controversy, but I don't think we understand just how deep the controversy was. Before I want to go into Churchill, let me just say something again about FDR. And FDR, during the war, had some controversial elements during the war, too. For example, he insisted on internment camps for the Japanese through Executive Order 9066. This was during the war, and he was doing controversial things then. And the major controversial thing that he did was that he ran for a third term, which at the time, yes, you could, but it was kind of breaking an American social faux pas. It was a very big faux pas. And again, his critics were comparing FDR to Hitler. So I just want to put that again into your memory, right? So the next person we're going to talk about is Churchill. So nowadays, Churchill is kind of looked as a bit of a hero, a war hero, what have you. But he was a very controversial figure as well. In fact, he had arguably committed war crimes. Does this sound familiar to someone, aka Netanyahu? So we have to look at Churchill. Churchill, for example, was responsible for creating a systematic doctrine that would target German cities. Now, I know the counter argument is that, well, the Germans were the first to attack cities, but it was more of just putting some pressure. It wasn't their main strategy, their main doctrine, whereas the British, their doctrine was to attack civilians. So just think about that. Churchill wanted the United States to target civilians. The bombing of Dresden was the biggest controversy, but there were many others. So my point with that is just to compare a little bit as to what was happening then to what is happening now. So those are the players. Now let's talk about leading into the conflict. So with that being said, I want you to imagine if the United States had decided to go against Germany when the Germans broke the agreement of entering the Rhineland, right? They sent troops into the Rhineland to occupy it. It was formerly part of German territory, so they said. So they went ahead and sent soldiers. Imagine if the U.S. had intervened then. Knowing what you know now about how critics viewed, especially they were isolationist in nature, again, similar to today, there was a strong isolationist sentiment, a strong America First sentiment that existed then. Had FDR done that, the critics would have been, they would have really gone into him. But and there would not have been a World War II, arguably, in Europe. We can see that now. We can see that had FDR decided to send the troops preemptively into the Rhineland to counter the Germans, then there would not have been a World War II, and might not have been all these disasters, or who knows what would have happened. So I want you to think about that and think about what's happening today in Iran. Right, the argument in Iran is so we went in, did what we had to do to prevent Iran from having even more power. And I will quote Marco Rubio on this because he said, I'm going to paraphrase what he said, but when the retaliation to the American bombing in February was to attack civilian targets with missiles, imagine if they had more of those. Imagine if they did have a nuke, right? So I just want to bring that to your attention. And I want to also talk a little bit about the conflict itself. So an argument that critics make about the war with Iran is that, an argument that can't be made is that, Nazi Germany was quite a power, was a formidable force. If we hadn't gotten involved, they would have lost, and they had all this power, right? They were sending tanks that were invading countries. Iran's not doing that, right? Well, Iran is, through its own way, creating proxy wars that is, in fact, creating chaos within the region. And it's about influence, not so much occupation as it is influence. If you look at the United States, just a little sidetrack here, the United States, after World War II, decided not to occupy whatever it had acquired territorially, but rather to be a strong influencer within it, because arguably, that's a much sounder strategy. Well, Iran is using the same thing. They're using these proxy wars with terrorist organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis to create enough chaos to where they can maintain influence in the region. Does that sound familiar? And so we have to consider that. And another thing that has to be considered is that Iran does have power. Clearly, look at what's happening with the Strait of Hormuz. Now we have nations that will run out of fuel within weeks if it's not opened. That's quite a bit of power. I mean, there are countries, we're going to see some countries at the end of this that are not going to recover. I don't know which ones, but some countries are just not going to recover. So just think about that kind of economic power that Iran is exerting over the world. And finally, we have to understand, now we know, like as I was saying, Germany looked like a strong power, but if you looked at the numbers, they only had, roughly 80 million troops. The British had 400 million, the empire, and then they were fighting the Soviets that had 120 million, I think it was. But at any rate, it was, by looking at the numbers, it was obvious that Germany could not win the war. It could not. And there were times where we thought, yes, the Germans were going to win if the Americans hadn't come in. But then a lot of Americans thought, well, why are we fighting now? The Germans aren't going to win. There's a bit of this wishy-washy sentiment as to whether or not we were going to defeat the Germans. The same thing with Iran. What's happening now? We're going to win. Well, we're going to win. Yeah, maybe not. We're going to win. There's this wishy-washy sentiment as well. Anyway, I wanted to bring up these similarities because I want you to think about what's happening in Iran. And if you think that knowing now what you know about these two similarities, if it was a good thing or not for the United States to decide to enter the Middle East as it did and to neutralize the threat of Iran. Imagine if this strategy had been used prior to the Nazis attacking Poland in 1939. What kind of world would we have been living in Germany or in Europe? Anyway, that's all I have for today. Questions, comments, so long.